Mark 1. Now, before jumping into talking about the history with the Navy, which is not, there's not too much to go off of with the Navy, I'm actually going to talk about the Army's development, because those two masks pretty much go hand in hand, essentially being the exact same fucking thing, except for one of them being issued to the Navy and one of them being issued to the Army. Now, the Army version of this mask, which, like I said, is the same thing, is the M1 diaphragm, M1 Army diaphragm gas mask. Generally, the differences from the Army mask and the Navy mask are sometimes a different canister and sometimes a different head harness. Now, if an Army mask, let's say an M1 with an M2 head harness and an M4 canister was issued to the Navy, it would automatically become a Navy Diaphragm-Mark 1 with no differences in the hardware whatsoever. Basically, what I'm trying to say is they could be the exact same. It just depends on what branch they were issued to. Now, the Army actually adopted the M1 diaphragm after testing in the early 1920s with the experimental diaphragm mask 332, which was the designation of the experimental M1, and it was standardized in 1925 as the M112. If you don't know, the M112 diaphragm mask is the M1 diaphragm with an M1 felt filter and an M2 carrier. I actually have an M2 carrier right here. Unfortunately, it's really difficult to find existing examples of the M1 felt filter, also known as the model of 1919 felt filter. I'll probably put a picture of it on screen. The Army also used a couple different canisters with this mask, such as the M2 felt filter, which is not too far off from the M1 felt filter. The only difference being the M2 felt filter has an impregnated felt filter around the charcoal canister and has an olive drab painted rain guard on the top. And the M4 canister, the M4 service canister. Now, unfortunately, I don't have an example of an M4 service canister, but I do have an M8 canister, which is fairly similar, but not exactly the same. Here's is the M8 canister. The main difference from this and an M4 externally anyways is the M4 has a sharper curved elbow and a smaller inlet. I believe there's some internal differences. The M4 has a spring on the inside compressing that charcoal, whereas I don't believe the M8 canister actually does that. So sometime after the Army adopted the M112 diaphragm mask, the Navy ended up adopting that design probably around maybe 1926, 1927. I haven't found concrete evidence for that, but that generally around that area. This, for the Navy, essentially replaced the service masks that they were using, such as the model of 1919, the M111 service mask, and the M112 service mask around the early mid-1920s. This basically replaced those masks completely, although the Navy did still use those masks for a period of time. But the diaphragm was very necessary for the Navy because it allowed better communication, especially for radio communication and just overall general communication, which is why the Navy generally favored diaphragm masks. And that mindset pretty much went throughout World War II and even post-World War II with because you have the Mark II, the Mark III, the Mark IV, and then post-war the Mark V. And as for the M1 and M2 diaphragms, as well as the other diaphragms, of course those were meant for the same purposes, where the M1 was issued to people who use comms, and the general service mask was issued to standard infantry. But for the Navy, it completely replaced those service masks. Now, my particular example, if this was an Army mask, this would technically be an M1A1 Army diaphragm mask instead of the M1. The main difference from the M1 and the M1A1, just like on the service mask, is the M1 has crimped eye lenses and the M1A1 has threaded eye lenses. And you can see pretty much uses the bases of an M1A1 facepiece. Now, the Navy used this mask as well as the Navy Diaphragm-Mark II after that was introduced sometime in the 1930s. I don't remember exactly when. But they used those two masks well into the late 1940s throughout World War II. Not being obsoleted until 1944. Of course, the majority of them being replaced by the Navy Diaphragm-Mark III and the Navy Diaphragm-Mark IV. Same goes for the Mark II. I actually have, just as for a comparison, I have a pretty fried example of a Mark II right here. I'm just going to set it down. Essentially, you could see the differences in the diaphragm. See the Mark 1 or the M1 has a circular diaphragm that has the exhale valve extruding from the bottom, same with the hose. Whereas this, you can sort of see the external tubes that lead up to the eye lenses for the TISO tubes, and the flutter valves in the middle right here. I think this design was done to cut down on the bulk of this mask, and that's why they did that. This actually unscrews, and you can actually replace the diaphragm, but I don't want to attempt to do that because the diaphragm itself is actually made of a thin piece of Bakelite, rather than something like clear plastic, where you start seeing that later down the line. Moving on to the more mysterious part of this mask is the actual Navy issue canister. These are commonly seen on later iterations of the Navy masks. Early on, they were mostly just using the Army issue stuff. But somewhere down the line, they decided to start issuing replacement canisters of their own. The designation of this canister is actually unknown. There is speculation on the designation, but I'd rather not mention it, just so it can't be misconstrued. But the one thing I really like about this canister is the integrated elbow that it has on the top. Now, the one thing that's kind of stupid is you cannot easily replace the inlet valve if it were to be damaged, because it's stamped into the metal at the bottom. Something else I wanted to mention is this is probably very similar to an Army canister in internal construction, and is also probably a radial flow canister. And again, I guess I can bring out the M8 canister just for reference. Here's your typical Army canister of that time period, pretty much, and then the Navy canister. Here I can give you a close-up of the diaphragm and an actual intact flutter valve, which is very surprising considering the condition of the rest of the facepiece. Now, something too I want to mention, the Army variant will have an M2 head harness instead of the M3 coil spring head harness. Mine is actually unfortunately missing a rivet, and I put tape on it to try to hold it down, but it's coming undone, unfortunately. And this harness essentially has non-elasticated fabric towards the facepiece, and then has coil springs for the head harness, which is kind of a dumb design. I don't understand why they did this. Now, on very early M112s, the head harness was actually the M1 head harness, which instead of adjusting at the tabs on the facepiece, it adjusted from the head pad. Now that was soon replaced with the M2 head harness, and then of course when the Navy started being issued these masks, at some point down the line they started replacing them with the M3 coil spring head harness for some reason. I'm sure there's a reason to it. Honestly, they stuck with the coil spring for a fairly decent amount of time. Here would be a US stamp, and then the size 2 right there. You can see the threaded lenses. Okay, that's just going to fall out. Let's move that out the way, I guess. Here you can see the head harness tabs, typical for an M1A1 facepiece or an M1 facepiece, but obviously this is the basis of an M1A1. Now, this technically is an M1A1 diaphragm mask for the Army. For the Navy, it does not change the designation whatsoever. It is still a Mark 1 Navy diaphragm. Here you have a lot number and some markings on the exhale valve. It says lot 76. You probably can't even see that. And then Mark 2. This exhale valve is actually really pliable. I'm actually kind of surprised because usually you'll find them and they're fried. It seems to be opposite. Very minty face pieces will have a fried exhale valve, whereas very fried face pieces will have a minty exhale valve. I don't understand it. But yeah. This is I could get the inside of the face piece. As you can see, the face piece is made of a brown gum rubber. And you can see the TISO deflection system down there. It is just a Y tube that sort of curves out of the way of the diaphragm. And you can see how the exhale valve is actually installed. Essentially, they just inserted it into this metal stem and then folded it down and wire and taped it on the inside, so it's a lot shorter. This mask is actually a size 2. These were made in 5 different sizes, 1 being extra or very small, and then 5 being very large. Whereas later on with the Mark II diaphragm, it uses the bases of a M1A2 facepiece, so it's just a size universal. Moving on to the carrier, there were 2 carriers issued with this mask. Earlier on, they issued the M2 carrier, which is actually what I have right here. But I know what you're thinking, like, it looks like a normal kidney carrier, but actually this is the predecessor to all kidney carrier designs. And I say kidney carrier, which is a post-war name. I don't really like to call them that, but so you have the M2 carrier, and then after that there was the M3 carrier, which essentially all that is an M2 carrier with the tuck right here sewn together so the fabric can stay out of the way of the inlet of the canister. Because if you don't already know, the M2 carrier was mainly made for canisters with the inlet at the top, such as the M1 felt filter, the M2 felt filter, and the M3 filter. Now, the canister would have had directions, but unfortunately those are missing. I'm sure you've seen them. You've seen the directions on the M8 canister that I just shown. So yeah, now the hose is a typical 27-inch hose, seen on pretty much every service mask, with the stockinette up until 1940 when they started issuing Class B gray hoses with the later service masks. This actually came with the kit. Anti-dimming stick for gas mask. This is really one of the really earlier ones. It's just a you can see it's just a dim stick with a cloth wrapped around it. Also, something very interesting I found while looking for documents for this thing, specifically for the Navy Mark I diaphragm, is actually in frigid temperatures, there would be issues with the flutter valve actually freezing. So in order to prevent that, they actually used glycerin. Essentially, it was just a winterization thing where it stopped the exhale valve from sticking to itself in frigid temperatures after, because when you exhale air, of course, that air is moist, and in freezing temperatures it would freeze. So the glycerin would prevent that from happening. I hope you guys enjoyed. I'll be doing a video on the Mark II very soon. See you in the next one.